Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into some seriously complex and honestly fiercely debated territory right off the bat. We're going to unpack a highly critical source text that offers a pretty somber graduate-level look at the historical origins and the modern impact of gender theory. Now, the author of this text takes a very firm stance. They argue that modern concepts of gender fluidity aren't just medical advancements, but actually part of a destructive ideological lineage that traces all the way back to the work of psychologist John Money. So my goal for us today is to impartially walk you through exactly how this author constructs this argument. We'll break down their claims, the historical case studies they use, and their deeper philosophical warnings. It's definitely a heavy topic, but it's absolutely crucial to understand from a structural perspective. Let's get into it.
Okay, so to start, we need to look at the foundational hook the author uses to anchor their entire critique. Before even uttering the word gender, the text sets up this really stark contrast between philosophy and ideology. According to the source, true philosophy is all about reforming our subjective desires to match an objective truth. Ideology, on the flip side, is defined here as reforming truth to match our subjective desires. The author makes the case that society has fundamentally drifted away from anchored objective truths. They describe it as being like a ship that's completely lost its anchor. And instead, we've embraced ideologies that literally reshape reality to fit whatever it is we happen to feel or desire at the moment. This philosophical drift? That's the lens through which the text views absolutely everything that follows. So, you might be wondering, how exactly does this ideological drift play out in reality? Well, the text pinpoints a very specific historical moment and a specific person responsible for what it labels Idea 13 in a long line of societal shifts. This idea is the concept of gender identity, and it was introduced and really popularized by Dr. John Money. The author is quick to point out that before Money's work, the word gender was basically just interchangeable with biological sex. But Money argued something different. He proposed that an individual's psychological sense of being male, female, or something else could be entirely separated from their physical, biological reality. And the source frames this not as some major scientific breakthrough, but as a deliberate and, in their view, catastrophic ideological shift. But of course, these ideas didn't just appear out of thin air. The text maps out an intellectual genealogy that traces straight back to Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a highly controversial figure who pushed really hard to erase the traditional boundaries around human sexual behavior. And Money himself actually admitted that Kinsey's challenge to societal norms directly inspired him to start questioning the rigid binaries of gender. The text makes the argument that Money basically just took Kinsey's ideas about a continuum of sexual behavior and applied that exact same logic to a continuum of gender. He saw it as just the next logical step in this progressive, boundaryless ideology. Building on that spark of inspiration, we arrive at Money's core thesis. He persistently claimed that gender roles and identities are not biologically innate. No, instead, he believed they're entirely constructed by society. They're learned, and they're reinforced through socialization and how you're brought up. The source points out that Money was intensely motivated to prove this theory true, to prove once and for all that biology doesn't dictate gender, the environment does. But to actually prove it, Money needed a case study.
And this brings us to the text's primary historical case study of Money's methodology. It's a deeply tragic story, the David Reimer case. In 1965, twin boys, Bruce and Brian, were born. But at 8 months old, Bruce suffered a botched circumcision. His desperate parents went to Dr. Money for help. Money advised him to physically reassign Bruce through surgery and raise him as a girl named Brenda. For Money, this was the perfect, real-world opportunity to prove that socialization absolutely trumps biology. The source recounts how Brenda was subjected to some deeply uncomfortable, explicit role-playing guided by Money. But despite all of this, Brenda experienced immense psychological distress. Ultimately, at age 14, Brenda discovered the truth and transitioned back to male, taking the name David. The text heavily emphasizes the devastating psychological fallout of this entire experiment, which tragically ended in the suicides of both Brian and later in 2004, David. For the author, this case is the ultimate, undeniable proof of the failure and cruelty of Money's theories. Now, the author doesn't just leave this tragedy in the past, they forcefully connect it right to our contemporary moment. The text cites modern activists, specifically people who have transitioned and subsequently regretted it, folks like Scott Nugent and Chloe Cole. They use their testimonies as evidence of the widening, devastating impact of Money's foundational ideas. By also bringing in critics like Abigail Shrier, the source argues that this ideology, initiated all those years ago by Money, has now completely seduced the minds of modern youth. And the result, according to the author, is a massive, evolving fallout that essentially mirrors the Reimer family tragedy, but on a global scale.
Let's shift gears for a second and look at how this ideology actually built the medical infrastructure we see today. The author points our attention to a pivotal year, 1965. This was when Dr. John Money helped establish the Gender Identity Clinic at Johns Hopkins University. But the text doesn't view this as some great medical milestone. Quite the opposite. It frames 1965 as the origin point for the institutionalization of what the author bluntly calls procedures of human butchery. They argue this clinic laid the groundwork for the widespread gender-affirming surgeries we see happening today.
To really drive home their severe critique, the author provides a highly detailed clinical breakdown of the surgical procedures themselves, starting with phalloplasty. This is an incredibly complex process. It involves tissue harvesting, constructing a neourethra, attaching the phallus, and sometimes a scrotoplasty. But the commentary surrounding these facts is stark. The text highlights the massive financial burden of these procedures. We're talking anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000, and stresses that they basically turn people into lifelong medical patients. The source argues that these surgeries require constant, painful maintenance, they carry high infection rates, and they entirely fail to provide natural biological function. Ultimately, the author characterizes the whole enterprise as being heavily fueled by corporate greed.
The text applies that exact same intense scrutiny to vaginoplasty methods. The source lists out the common techniques: penile inversion, peritoneal grafts, and intestinal grafts. But again, it's the author's harsh characterization that takes center stage here. The text strongly condemns these procedures, pointing out that they require lifelong dilation and artificial lubrication. The author gets quite graphic, describing these surgeries as the creation of an open flesh wound that has to be artificially maintained against the body's own natural healing processes. They frame the risks and the long-term complications as just unacceptably high and, frankly, medically unethical.
And this really illustrates the author's expanding concern, because it's not just about the surgery, it's also about the pharmacology. The text sounds an urgent alarm regarding the hormone therapies being handed out by modern clinics, especially when it comes to minors. The source specifically calls out luprolide acetate, which is an LHRH agonist. And the text is super quick to point out a highly controversial detail here. Historically, this drug was used for the chemical castration of sex offenders. The author expresses deep dismay that such incredibly powerful drugs are now routinely given to confused youth, sometimes the text claims even without parental consent. For the author, this shift in application really cements their view that this entire medical framework is fundamentally destructive.
Now, as you might know, advocates of gender theory will often point to intersex conditions as biological proof that gender exists on a spectrum. Well, the author counters this argument directly using statistics. Citing the Intersex Society of North America, they note that only about 0.05% to 0.07% of live births result in a visibly identifiable intersex condition. The author leverages this incredibly tiny number to argue that these are very rare biological anomalies. They insist that such rare exceptions should absolutely not be used as a baseline to redefine human sexuality for the vast majority of the population. To further drive a wedge between biological reality and what they view as ideological claims, the text provides a detailed categorization of these actual intersex conditions. We're talking about specific genetic causes and traits for conditions like androgen insensitivity syndrome, CAH, and Turner syndrome. The author definitely acknowledges these genuine, rare medical conditions with sympathy. However, they firmly insist that these biological realities are entirely distinct from modern, subjective claims of gender dysphoria. The core critique here is that the medical establishment, heavily influenced by Money's legacy, is taking physically healthy, biologically typical individuals who are experiencing psychological confusion, and instead of helping them reorient to reality, doctors are literally reorienting reality to affirm their confusion.
The text then circles back to John Money to issue a pretty stark warning about where this ideology might lead us next. The author outlines Money's extensive research into paraphilias, which are atypical sexual interests. This includes conditions like fetishism, transvestic disorder, sadism, and even pedophilia. The source issues a firm, cautious warning here. They argue that the exact same progressive evolutionary logic used to deconstruct gender binaries could soon be utilized by activist groups to normalize or destigmatize these dangerous disorders. The underlying fear is that without objective boundaries, eventually all behaviors become permissible.
And that brings us to the author's ultimate conclusion, a concept they call the societal shipwreck. The text argues that Western civilization is in a state of collapse. Why? Because it has abandoned the objective moral guidelines of the Judeo-Christian ethic. In its place, society has adopted this subjective, Darwinian worldview.
A worldview where humans basically view themselves either merely as animals or, on the flip side, as their own gods, completely capable of defining reality and morality on a whim. For the author, the medical exploitation of children and the chaotic state of modern gender identity aren't just isolated issues. They are the direct, tangible wreckage of this massive philosophical shift.
So, we end today with the underlying philosophical challenge that the source text presents to its readers. If society continues down this path, if objective truths about human biology and morality are completely abandoned in favor of affirming subjective, ever-changing desires, upon what reliable foundation will our future ethics be built? The author leaves us to ponder the ultimate cultural cost of this intellectual drift. It's a highly provocative question, and honestly, regardless of where you personally stand on this issue, understanding the structure of this critique is absolutely vital for grasping the deeper philosophical battle currently playing out in our culture. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the ideas that shape our world.